Now I have thorough research context. Let me write the full script. An entirely original story inspired by the psychological engine of the title, authority figure in a liminal death-adjacent space, plus handed-down survival wisdom, plus rules, implying hidden danger, but transformed into a completely different narrative execution. I took the job at Fielder Memorial Gardens because my unemployment had run out 3 weeks prior, and my landlord had started taping notes to my door instead of texting. There's a specific kind of desperation that comes when you watch your bank account dip below $200 and, rent is 11 days away. You stop being selective. You stop caring about hours, about distance, about what the work actually involves. When I saw the listing on the County Employment Board, Overnight Property Monitor, Fielder Memorial Gardens, 1650 HR, immediate start. I called the number before I finished reading the full description. The woman who answered had a voice like someone who'd been awake for a long time. She told me the position was simple. The cemetery had experienced some issues with vandalism over the past year, some problems with people getting onto the property after dark, and the board of directors had approved funding for a night attendant. She asked if I had reliable transportation. She asked if I was comfortable being alone for extended periods. She asked if I had any history of sleepwalking, which I thought was a strange question, but I said no. She told me to come in the following Monday at 4 p.m. and to ask for a man named Gatlin. I want to describe the drive out there because it matters. Fielder Memorial Gardens sat about 14 miles outside of town, past the point where the 2-lane road stopped having a center line and the houses thinned out into long stretches of fenced pasture and scrub pine. The cemetery itself was on a gentle slope of land that backed up against a low ridge covered in cedar trees. There was a stone wall running along the road frontage, maybe 3 feet high, old enough that some of the capstones had shifted and grass was growing between the joints. The entrance was a pair of iron gates, not ornate, just functional, set between 2 brick columns. A small metal sign read, Fielder Memorial Gardens, Est 1923, and below that a newer sign, laminated and zip-tied to the gate, listed the visiting hours as sunrise to sunset. I pulled in and followed a paved loop road that curved through the property. The cemetery was larger than I expected. There were probably 300 or 400 graves spread across several acres, some of them clustered under old oak trees, some of them in open sections, where the headstones were flat bronze markers set flush with the ground. There was a maintenance building near the back of the property, a long, single-story cinder block structure with a metal roof and 2 garage bay doors. Next to it sat a smaller building that looked like it might have been an office or chapel at some point. It had a covered porch and windows with pull-down shades. I parked near the smaller building and got out. The air was different out there. Not bad, just still. That heavy stillness you get in places that are surrounded by trees on 3 sides, with no traffic noise to fill the gaps. I could hear birds. I could hear the faint ticking of my engine cooling. That was about it. A man came out of the maintenance building, wiping his hands on a rag. He was maybe 60, maybe older. Lean, sun-darkened skin, wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been in weather for decades. Deep lines around the eyes, thin lips, a jaw that moved slightly like he was always working on something in the back of his mouth. He introduced himself as Gatlin. No first name offered, no handshake. He looked at my car, looked at my shoes, looked at my face, and said, "You the night man?" I said I was. He nodded and told me to follow him into the office building. The inside was exactly what you'd expect. from a place that had been built in the 1950s or 60s and maintained with the absolute minimum budget since then. Linoleum floors, wood-paneled walls, a drop ceiling with a few of the tiles stained brown from old water damage. There was a metal desk with a phone on it, a folding chair, a space heater, and a small television that was connected to a 4-channel security system showing grayscale feeds of different parts of the property. The monitor had a faint green tint to it, and the image quality was poor, the kind where you could make out shapes and movement but not much detail. Gatlin explained the job in plain terms. My shift would be 10 at night to 6 in the morning. I'd sit in this office, keep an eye on the security cameras, and do 2 walking rounds of the property during the night, one at midnight, one at 3. If I saw anyone on the grounds, I was to call the county sheriff's non-emergency line and let them handle it. I was not to approach anyone myself. If there was a problem with the sprinkler system or the irrigation timer, I was to note it on the log sheet, and Gatlin would deal with it in the morning. He showed me where the log binder was kept, a thick 3-ring binder with lined paper, and where the flashlights were stored, and how to lock and unlock the front gate. It was all straightforward. The kind of job where the main qualification is being willing to stay awake in an empty building for 8 hours. I told him I could start that night. He said fine. Then he sat down on the edge of the desk and pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a single sheet of yellow legal paper, handwritten in neat block letters. He unfolded it and held it for a moment, looking at it, and then set it on the desk in front of me. I wrote some things down for you, he said. Stuff that doesn't really fit in the regular orientation, but that you'll want to know. I looked at the paper. There were 8 items written on it, numbered. I started reading the first one, but Gatlin put his finger on the page and said, "Read it later, after I leave. Read all of it and don't skip anything. If something on this list doesn't make sense to you right now, it will." I asked him what he meant. He pulled his hand back from the paper and stood up. "This is a good job," he said. "Quiet, decent pay for what it is. I've been working these grounds for 31 years, and I haven't had a problem I couldn't handle. But I work days. Nights out here are different. Not dangerous exactly, but different. The property behaves different after dark. You'll see what I mean." He told me a few more things. Where the circuit breaker was, how the space heater sometimes tripped it, that the bathroom was in the maintenance building, and here was the key. Then he left. I heard his truck start up outside and the crunch of gravel as he pulled away. And then it was just me in that office with the hum of the security monitor and the ticking of a wall clock that I hadn't noticed until everything else went silent. I sat down at the desk and unfolded the yellow paper again. Under the fluorescent light, Gatlin's handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, each letter formed carefully. Here is what it said, as close to word for word as I can remember. 1. The motion-activated floodlights on the east side of the maintenance building will sometimes trigger between 1 and 2 in the morning. This does not mean someone is there. Do not go outside to check when this happens. The lights will shut off on their own after 90 seconds. Wait for them to shut off. If they do not shut off after 90 seconds, note the time in the log and stay inside. 2. During your midnight round, walk the paved loop road only. Do not walk between the headstones after dark. If you drop something off the path, leave it and retrieve it in the daylight. 3. The phone in the office will ring occasionally. If it rings before midnight, answer it. It will be the security company or occasionally the board chairwoman checking in. If it rings after midnight, do not answer it. Let it ring. It will stop. 4. Section D is the oldest part of the cemetery. At the back of the property, near the Cedar Ridge. You will not need to walk through Section D during your rounds. The loop road does not go through it. Do not enter Section D at night for any reason. 5. If you hear what sounds like digging or scraping from the direction of the maintenance building during your shift, it is most likely the irrigation pump cycling. The pump is old and makes noise. However, if the sound continues for more than 10 minutes without stopping, turn off the irrigation system using the switch panel in the office closet. Instructions for the panel are taped to the inside of the closet door. 6. You may notice that one of the camera feeds, the one labeled KM3, which covers the north section, occasionally shows movement that you cannot identify. Do not adjust the camera. Do not zoom in. Log what you see with the time and move on. 7. The door to the office has a deadbolt. Use it. Keep the door locked during your entire shift, except when leaving for your rounds. When you return from a round, lock it again immediately. 8. If at any point during the night you feel a strong, specific urge to walk to Section D, not curiosity, not boredom, but an urge, like something is pulling your attention there, sit down, turn on the radio or the television, and do not leave the office until the feeling passes. It will pass. It always does. I read the list twice. Then I set it down and looked at the security monitor. The 4 camera feeds showed the front gate, the loop road near the office, the north section, KM3, and what appeared to be the back of the maintenance building. Nothing was moving on any of them. The property looked exactly like what it was. An empty cemetery in the early evening, the headstones catching the last of the amber light before it faded. My first reaction was that Gatlin was testing me, or maybe hazing me in the way that older workers sometimes do with new hires. Leave the guy a creepy list, see if he shows up for his second shift. I'd worked enough jobs to know that some people get territorial about their workplace and like to scare off newcomers. The part about Section D and the phone ringing after midnight, it read like something out of a campfire story. I almost laughed. Almost. But the handwriting bothered me. It wasn't hasty or playful. It was deliberate. Each instruction was written with the same careful, even pressure, the way you write something you've thought about for a long time. And the last item, the one about the urge, that one didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like a warning from someone who'd experienced exactly what he was describing. I folded the paper, put it in my back pocket, and spent the next few hours getting used to the space. I figured out that the radio in the corner worked, but only picked up 2 stations, one playing country and one playing what sounded like a Spanish language talk show. I made a cup of instant coffee using the electric kettle on the filing cabinet. I familiarized myself with the camera feeds. The images refreshed every few seconds rather than showing a smooth live feed, so there was a slight stuttering quality to the picture. A frozen instant replaced by another frozen instant. It made everything look like it was moving in stop motion. Around 9:30, the last of the daylight drained out of the sky, and the cameras switched to their night mode, which was even grainier. The front gate camera showed the road beyond the entrance, empty and dark. The loop road camera showed the nearest row of headstones, pale shapes against the dark grass. Cam 3 showed the north section, which was more open, with flat markers and a few young trees that had been planted recently enough that they still had support stakes. The maintenance building camera showed the back wall and the edge of the parking area where my car was sitting. At 10 o'clock, I officially started my shift. I locked the deadbolt, I sat at the desk, and I waited. The first thing I learned about being alone in a building at the edge of a cemetery at night is that you become hyper aware of every sound the building makes. The space heater clicking on and off, The fluorescent tube above the desk buzzing at a frequency that sat right on the edge of perception, just enough to make you aware of it if you stopped doing anything else. The wall clock ticking, the occasional creak of the roof, expanding or contracting with the temperature change. Every few minutes, there was a distant metallic groan that I eventually identified as the irrigation pump that Gatlin had mentioned. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. A low hum, then a click, then silence, then the hum again. I read a book I'd brought. I drank my coffee. I checked the cameras. Nothing happened. At 11:45, I put on my jacket and grabbed the larger of the two flashlights from the shelf. I unlocked the deadbolt, stepped outside, and locked the office behind me. The air had cooled significantly. There was no wind. The sky was overcast, no moon visible, and the darkness beyond the reach of the single sodium light mounted on the side of the office building was absolute. Not city darkness where there's always ambient glow from somewhere. This was rural darkness, the kind that has texture and weight to it, the kind where your eyes keep trying to adjust and never quite get there. I started walking the loop road. The flashlight beam cut a yellow cone ahead of me, illuminating the asphalt and the edges of the grass on either side. The headstones were visible as pale shapes off to my left and right, rows of them receding into the dark. Some of them were tall, old granite columns, crosses, obelisks, and some were small, the modest flat markers of more recent burials. I could hear my footsteps and nothing else. No insects, no wind, no traffic from the road. The silence was so complete that I became aware of my own breathing and had to consciously stop listening to it. The loop road was about a half-mile around. I walked it at a steady pace, sweeping the flashlight left and right, checking for anything out of the ordinary. I passed the maintenance building, which was dark and closed up. I passed Section B, which had a stone bench near the path, where someone had left a small artificial flower arrangement. I passed the area near the front gate where the oldest accessible graves were, some of them dating back to the 1930s. The road curved along the property's western edge, where the stone wall ran, and then swung back toward the office. I paused at one point and turned the flashlight toward the back of the property, toward where I assumed Section D was. From the road, all I could see was a dark mass of cedar trees and the suggestion of the ridge behind them. The land sloped up slightly in that direction. There was no lighting back there, no path that I could see. It was just a wall of darkness with trees in it. I finished my round in about 15 minutes, let myself back into the office, locked the deadbolt, and sat down. Everything was fine. The cameras showed nothing. The pump groaned intermittently in the distance. I made another cup of coffee and settled in for the long middle stretch of the night. At 12:20, the phone rang. I stared at it. Gatlin's note had said that calls before midnight were normal, from the security company or the board chairwoman. This was after midnight, 20 minutes after. The phone was an old desk model, beige plastic with a coiled cord, and it produced a sharp mechanical ring that was louder than I expected in that small room. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. I watched it the way you watch something you're not sure about, not afraid exactly, but alert, aware of a decision being made in real time. It rang 2 more times and stopped. I wrote it in the log. 12:20 a.m., phone rang. Did not answer per instruction. The office felt quieter after the phone stopped. Not just quiet, but specifically, deliberately silent, as if the ringing had pushed all other sound out of the room and the silence was rushing back in to fill the space. I turned on the radio. The country station was playing something slow and twangy that I didn't recognize. It helped. At 1:07, the east side floodlights kicked on. I saw it on the maintenance building camera first. The feed suddenly flared white as the lights activated, washing out the image for a moment before the camera auto-adjusted and showed the lit-up gravel area behind the building. Nothing was there. No person, no animal, nothing moving. The light was harsh and flat, the kind that security floods produce, making everything look overexposed and slightly unreal. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 1:07. Gatlin had said between 1 and 2. He'd said wait 90 seconds. I counted. At around 60 seconds, the lights were still on. At 70 seconds, still on. I was watching the camera feed, expecting to see what had triggered the motion sensor, a cat, a raccoon, a branch blowing into the detection zone. There was nothing. At 85 seconds, the light shut off and the camera feed went dark again, returning to its dim night mode gray. 90 seconds. Close enough. I didn't write that one in the log. I'm not sure why. Maybe because Gatlin had described it with such certainty. The lights would trigger, they'd shut off. It was nothing that it didn't feel like an event worth recording. It felt like part of the building's routine, the same as the pump cycling or the heater clicking. At 2:15, I noticed something on Cam 3. I'd been glancing at the cameras every few minutes, a habit I was developing, and during one of these glances I saw that the north section feed looked different. Not dramatically different. The framing was the same, the open field with the flat markers, the young staked trees, the edge of the loop road, visible at the bottom of the frame. But there was something in the middle distance, roughly in the center of the image, that hadn't been there before. A dark shape, roughly vertical, maybe 3 feet tall. It wasn't moving. It wasn't clearly defined. On the grainy, stuttering camera feed, it could have been anything. A shadow, a marker I hadn't noticed before, a trick of the night mode processing. But I'd been looking at that same feed all night, and I was fairly sure the shape was new. I watched it through several refresh cycles of the camera. The image stuttered and updated. The shape remained in the same position. It didn't move, didn't change size, didn't resolve into anything identifiable. It was just there. A dark vertical interruption in the field, like a post or a stump that had appeared where there hadn't been one before. Gatlin's note said not to adjust the camera, not to zoom in, log it and move on. I picked up a pen. 2:15 a.m. Possible anomaly on Cam 3. Dark shape, north section, stationary, unable to identify. I put the pen down, but I didn't move on. I kept watching. Every few seconds, the feed refreshed and the shape was still there. I tried to judge its distance from the road, its size relative to the trees I could see at the edges of the frame, but the image quality made it impossible to be precise. I sat there for probably 10 minutes, just watching the feed cycle through its stuttering updates, and the shape never changed. Then on one refresh it was gone. The feed updated and the north section looked exactly the way it had at the beginning of the night. Open field, flat markers, staked trees, road edge. No dark shape. Whatever it had been, and I told myself it had probably been a shadow, some artifact of the low-resolution camera, some interaction between the infrared sensor and the environment. It was gone. I stared at the feed for another 5 minutes. Nothing. I turned my attention away and realized my hands were cold. Not from the temperature in the room, which was comfortable enough with the space heater running, but from the way I'd been sitting, tense, still, my hands flat on the desk, not moving. I hadn't noticed the tension building in my body until it released. I shook my hands out and took a breath, At 2:50, I put my jacket on for the 3 o'clock round. I checked all 4 camera feeds. Everything looked normal. I grabbed the flashlight, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped outside. The temperature had dropped further. My breath was visible in the flashlight beam. I started the loop road again, same direction as before, same pace. The cemetery was motionless. The headstones stood in their rows like they'd been planted there, which in a way they had. The sodium light from the office receded behind me as I walked, and the darkness ahead was absolute. I was about halfway around the loop when I heard something. It was faint, and my first instinct was to stop walking so my footsteps wouldn't mask it. I stood still on the road and listened. The sound was coming from my right, from somewhere deeper in the property, possibly from the direction of the maintenance building. It was a scraping sound. Not loud, not rhythmic, just a slow, intermittent scraping, like something being dragged across a hard surface, or like a shovel being worked into packed dirt. The irrigation pump, I told myself. Gatlin said it makes noise. Old equipment in an old building, metal parts moving against each other. I waited, listening, counting the seconds. The scraping continued. It had a quality that made it hard to pin down. Sometimes it sounded close, other times it seemed to shift, as if the source were moving, or as if the sound were bouncing off the stone wall in the building and the trees in ways that distorted its origin. I counted to 60. The scraping had not stopped. I counted to another 60. Still going. Gatlin's note said if it continued for more than 10 minutes, turn off the irrigation system. I checked my watch. I'd been standing here for maybe 3 minutes. I decided to finish my round, get back to the office, and time it properly. I walked the rest of the loop faster than I'd intended. Not running, but a deliberate, quick stride, the flashlight swinging ahead of me. When I reached the office, I unlocked the door, went inside, locked it, and stood still, listening. I couldn't hear the scraping from inside the office. The walls were cinder block, thick enough to muffle exterior sounds. I checked the cameras. The maintenance building feed showed nothing unusual. The other feeds were clear. I opened the closet door. Inside, there was a small electrical panel with a series of labeled switches, and taped to the inside of the door was a laminated instruction sheet explaining the irrigation zones and the master shutoff. I looked at it but didn't flip anything. I wasn't sure the sound had lasted 10 minutes. I stood there, my hand near the panel, and listened. The office was silent except for the heater and the clock and the monitor hum. I closed the closet door and sat back down. The rest of that first night passed without incident. No more scraping, no more anomalies on KM3, no more phone calls. At 6 in the morning, the first gray light of dawn appeared in the camera feeds, and the property slowly became visible in its ordinary daytime clarity. Headstones and grass and trees and gravel. When Gatlin's truck pulled in at 6:15, I met him outside and gave him the log binder. He read my entries without expression, nodded, and said, "See you tonight." I drove home and slept until 2 in the afternoon. When I woke up, I lay in bed and thought about the dark shape on KM3. I thought about the scraping. I thought about the phone ringing after midnight. And I thought about how Gatlin had written those instructions carefully, specifically, without any drama or embellishment. He hadn't told me the cemetery was haunted. He hadn't told me ghost stories. He'd given me practical instructions, the way you'd give someone instructions for operating a piece of equipment. If this happens, do this. If that happens, do that. There was something about the practicality of it that unsettled me more than any ghost story could have. It implied regularity. It implied that these things happened often enough to warrant a protocol. I went back that night, and the night after that. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned the rhythms of Fielder Memorial Gardens after dark. I learned that the floodlights on the east side triggered almost every night. usually between 1 and 1:30, and that they always shut off within 90 seconds. I learned that the phone rang after midnight about 3 nights out of 5, always between 12:15 and 12:45, always for the same duration, 6 to 8 rings, and that it always stopped on its own. I learned that the scraping sound from the direction of the maintenance building happened maybe twice a week, and it never lasted longer than 7 or 8 minutes. So I never had to use the irrigation shutoff panel. I learned that the SAM-3 anomaly, the dark shape in the north section, appeared about once every 3 or 4 nights, stayed for 10 to 20 minutes, and then vanished between one camera refresh and the next. I logged everything, I did my rounds, I kept the door locked. I stayed away from Section D. Here is what I want to say about the experience of working that job, about what it's actually like to sit alone in a building at the edge of a cemetery every night for weeks. It becomes normal faster than you'd think. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable and slightly troubling. By the end of the first week, the phone ringing after midnight didn't startle me. By the end of the second week, the dark shape on KM3 was just another thing I noted in the log between cups of coffee. The floodlights triggering was background noise. I developed a routine. Arrive at 10, lock up, make coffee, read, do the midnight round, settle in, do the 3 o'clock round, read more, wait for dawn. The strangeness of the place hadn't diminished exactly, but it had become familiar strangeness, the kind you coexist with, the way you coexist with a neighbor you don't understand, but who doesn't bother you. What I couldn't adapt to was Section D. Every night at some point during the quiet hours between 3 and 5, I would become aware of it. Not always the same way. Sometimes it was a thought that surfaced gradually, a slow recognition that I was thinking about the back of the property, about the cedar ridge, about the old graves behind the tree line. Other times it was more physical than mental, a sensation in my chest or my stomach, like a low magnetic pull, a directional gravity that wanted me to stand up and walk toward the back of the grounds. Gatlin had described it perfectly. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't boredom, it was an urge, specific, located, oriented, like something back there was aware of me and was gently, patiently suggesting that I come closer. The first few times it happened, I followed Gatlin's advice. I turned on the radio or the television and waited. The feeling passed within 15 or 20 minutes. It left behind a kind of residue, a washed-out tiredness, as if the urge had been drawing on my energy, and when it released me, I was depleted. I'd sit there feeling hollowed out and vaguely sad, and then the feeling would fade entirely, and I'd go back to my coffee and my book and the ticking of the clock. But there was one night, this was during my third week, when the urge was different. Stronger isn't the right word, more articulate. That's the closest I can get to describing it. On other nights, the pull toward Section D had been vague and formless, a compass needle swinging in one direction. On this night, it had specificity. I was sitting at the desk at around 4 in the morning, and I felt not just the pull toward Section D, but a clear sense that there was something specific back there that I needed to see, not wanted to see, needed to. The way you need to check a stove you think you left on, the way you need to look at a text message, is bad news. It was that kind of need, involuntary, insistent, laced with a certainty that felt like it had been placed inside me by something external. I turned on the radio. The country station was playing static at that hour, just a low hiss, with occasional fragments of signal bleeding through. I turned on the television. The security feed stared back at me. The gate, the road, the north section, the maintenance building, all clear. I looked at the Cam 3 feed. The dark shape was there. It had appeared while I wasn't watching, standing in the same position as always, a vertical interruption in the field, But this time I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, or maybe something that hadn't been there before. The shape seemed taller, not by a lot, but the proportional relationship between it and the staked trees had changed. Where before it had been maybe 3 feet tall, roughly the height of a post or a stump, now it looked closer to 5 feet. A height that was harder to attribute to a shadow or an equipment artifact. A height that was closer to a person. I sat there staring at it, and the urge towards Section D was pulsing in my chest like a second heartbeat. The two things, the shape on Cam 3 and the pull towards Section D, felt connected in a way I couldn't articulate. They weren't in the same part of the property. Cam 3 covered the north section, Section D was at the back, but the feeling was the same. The quality of attention was the same. Something about the property was awake and focused. And it was focused on me. I did not go to Section D. I sat at that desk with my hands flat on the surface and the radio hissing and the monitor cycling through its frames, and I did not leave the office. The urge lasted 45 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time. Minute by minute, the way you watch a timer on something you need to endure. At 4:48, the feeling released. The shape on Cam 3 was gone. The radio caught a signal and a song came through clearly, something about a highway and a woman's name. And the normalcy of it was so sharp and sudden that my eyes watered. The next morning when Gatlin arrived, I asked him about Section D. He was pouring coffee from a thermos into a steel cup, and he didn't look up. What about it? I told him about the urge. I told him it was getting stronger. I asked him what was back there. He took a drink of his coffee and looked out the office window toward the back of the property. The cedar ridge was visible from the window as a dark green line against the sky. Section D is the original burial ground, he said. Before this place was Fielder Memorial Gardens, before the county organized it, people buried their dead back there. Families from the area, goes back a long time. Some of those markers, you can't even read them anymore. I asked him why I wasn't supposed to go back there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A few years before I started here, there was a caretaker named Yardley, Lloyd Yardley. He worked days like me. Good worker. Knew the property better than anyone. One evening he stayed late to finish a job, and something took him back to Section D after dark. Nobody knows what. His wife called looking for him around 9 that night, and obviously no one was here to answer. They found him the next morning, sitting on the ground between two of the old markers back there. He was alive. He wasn't hurt. But he wasn't the same. He couldn't tell anyone what had happened, or wouldn't. He quit the next day and never came back. I heard he moved out of state." Gatlin took another drink of his coffee. "I went back there once during the day years ago to trim some branches that had fallen. It's just old graves. Small headstones, mostly fieldstone, a few carved ones. There's a wrought iron fence around part of it that's mostly collapsed. Nothing unusual to look at. But even during the day, I felt it. That pull, like the ground back there wants your attention. Like it's been waiting for someone to pay attention to it for a long time, and it doesn't know how to stop wanting that." He looked at me directly for the first time during the conversation. "So you don't go back there. That's the rule. Not because something will jump out at you. Nothing's going to jump out. But because whatever is back there, it's patient. And it's been pulling at people for a lot longer than you or I have been alive. And the smart thing to do is just not engage with it." I kept working the job. I needed the money. And the truth is, despite everything, it was the easiest work I'd ever had. 8 hours of sitting in a warm room, drinking coffee, reading books I'd been meaning to read for years. The strangeness was manageable as long as I followed the notes. I thought of Gatlin's list as a set of operating procedures for an unusual machine. The cemetery was the machine. The machine had quirks. You learned the quirks, and you accommodated them, and the machine ran fine. But there were a few things that happened in my 4th and 5th weeks that I haven't been able to file away as cleanly. One night at around 2 a.m. during a stretch when everything was quiet and normal, I was paging through the log binder and I found an entry that I hadn't written. It was on a page from several months before I'd started, dated March 14th, in handwriting that wasn't Gatlin's. It was smaller, more cramped, with a slight forward lean. The entry read, 2:47 a.m. She's standing in the road again. Closer to the office this time. Didn't log last 3 appearances because G said not to worry about it, but she's closer. She is definitely closer. Below that, in the same handwriting, a second entry, 3:15 a.m. Gone. Checked all cams, nothing. Want to go home. And below that, in different ink, as if added later, I think the phone calls are her. That was the only page with entries in that handwriting. I went through the entire binder. Every other entry was either mine or written in Gatlin's precise block letters. Whoever had written those March entries had worked the night shift before me and had apparently not lasted long. I thought about asking Gatlin about it, but something stopped me. Maybe I didn't want to know the answer. Maybe I was afraid the answer would be the same kind of careful, measured explanation he'd given me about Yardley in Section D. Not a lie, not the full truth. Just enough information to keep me functional without telling me what was actually happening. The other thing was the phone. On my 32nd night, the phone rang at 12:22, which was normal. I let it ring, as always. It rang 7 times and stopped, as always. But 2 minutes later, it rang again. This had never happened before. Every previous night, the post-midnight call had been a single event. One burst of ringing, then silence for the rest of the night. This second call started at 12:24, and I sat there watching the phone and counting rings. 7, 8, 9, 10. It didn't stop at 8. It kept ringing. 12, 15. I was gripping the edge of the desk. 20 rings, 25. The sound was mechanical, each ring identical to the last. The phone doing what it was designed to do with no variation, and yet the persistence of it, the refusal to stop, gave it a quality of intent, as if something on the other end was aware that I wasn't picking up and was determined to wait me out. At 31 rings, it stopped. I sat in the silence that followed, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. The office felt smaller. The fluorescent light seemed dimmer, though I knew it wasn't. I looked at the security monitor. All 4 feeds were normal. The property was empty and still, but my hands were shaking slightly, and when I tried to write the log entry, my handwriting was uneven. 12:24 a.m. Second phone call. Did not answer. Approx. 31 rings. The phone didn't ring again that night. But the next night it rang twice after midnight again. First, the normal call, then a second longer call about 2 minutes later. And the night after that. And the night after that. Each time the second call lasted longer. By the end of the week, the second call was ringing for over 2 minutes straight. I timed it. I sat there with my watch, and I timed it, and I tried to think of a rational explanation. A malfunctioning auto dialer, a wrong number set to repeat, some glitch in the phone system. And none of them accounted for why it only happened after midnight, why it had started so suddenly, after a month of single calls, and why the duration kept increasing. I found myself dreading the phone, not the first call, which had become routine, but the gap between the first and second calls. Those 2 minutes of silence were worse than the ringing. The silence was anticipatory. It was the silence of something drawing breath. On my 39th night, the second call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When it finally stopped, I unplugged the phone from the wall jack. I stared at the disconnected cord on the floor and felt a wash of relief that was immediately followed by guilt, as if I'd broken a rule, though disconnecting the phone was not on Gatlin's list. I left it unplugged for the rest of the night. In the morning, I plugged it back in before Gatlin arrived. I did this every night after that. Let the first call ring. Wait, let the second call start. Give it 10 seconds to confirm it wasn't going to stop. Unplug. The routine worked, but it changed the character of the job. The phone had been a passive object, part of the furniture, and now it was something I managed, something I had to attend to, and the act of unplugging it each night and plugging it back in each morning felt like a ritual, a small private ceremony of containment. On my 44th night, I broke one of Gatlin's rules. I didn't mean to. It wasn't defiance or curiosity. It was a mistake born of fatigue and routine. I was doing my 3 o'clock round, walking the loop road with the flashlight, and I was tired. More tired than usual. I'd had trouble sleeping during the day. My upstairs neighbor had been doing some kind of renovation, and I'd arrived at the cemetery already running on maybe 3 hours of rest. By 3 in the morning, my thoughts were sluggish, my reactions delayed. I was walking the loop on muscle memory. I dropped the flashlight. It slipped out of my hand when I was adjusting my jacket zipper, hit the pavement, and rolled. It rolled off the edge of the road and onto the grass and came to rest about 4 feet from the path, between 2 flat bronze markers. Gatlin's second instruction: if you drop something off the path, leave it and retrieve it in the daylight. I want to tell you that I remembered the instruction in time. I want to tell you that I stopped at the edge of the road and made the rational decision to walk the rest of the round in the dark and come back for the flashlight in the morning. But I was tired, and the flashlight was right there 4 feet away, still lit, its beam pointing sideways across the grass and illuminating the base of a headstone. I stepped off the road, 2 steps, that's all it took. I bent down, picked up the flashlight, and straightened up. When I straightened up, the air was different. I don't know how else to describe it. The temperature hadn't changed, there was no wind, but the quality of the air around me had shifted in some way that I could feel on my skin and in my lungs. It was denser, not humid, dense like the atmosphere itself had thickened, like I was standing in water instead of air. And there was a smell, faint, organic, sweet, in a way that was almost pleasant, but carried something underneath it that wasn't pleasant at all. It was the smell of turned earth, of soil that had been opened and closed, of organic matter in a state of change. I'd smelled it before, mildly, on the grounds during the day, but this was concentrated. This was close. I stepped back onto the road. 1 step, 2 steps, my feet on the asphalt. The density in the air released. The smell faded. I stood on the pavement and pointed the flashlight at the spot where I'd been standing, and it was just grass and markers, nothing else, the same as every other part of the cemetery. But my body was telling me something had been very close to me during those few seconds when I was off the path, close enough to feel, close enough to smell. I walked back to the office at a pace that was not quite running. I locked the door. I sat at the desk. I did not write it in the log. I worked 16 more nights after that. The phone calls continued their pattern. The floodlights triggered. CM3 showed its dark shape, and the urge towards Section D came and went like a tide. I followed the notes. I stayed on the road. I kept the door locked. And I started to understand something about Fielder Memorial Gardens that I think Gatlin understood too, that maybe Lloyd Yardley had understood in some terrible, flash of clarity on the night he sat down between those old markers and couldn't get back up. The cemetery was not haunted, not in the way that word is usually meant. Nothing was malicious. Nothing wanted to hurt me. The rules Gatlin had given me were not protection against an enemy. They were boundaries the way a levee is a boundary. What was in that ground, in all of that ground, but especially in Section D, especially in the oldest and deepest parts of the property, was something that seeped. It came up at night the way groundwater comes up when the water table rises. It wasn't hostile. It was just there, pressing against the surface, filling the air, reaching toward anything alive with the same blind, slow, inevitable pressure that roots exert against a foundation. And if you gave it a point of contact, if you stepped off the path, if you answered the phone, if you went to Section D, if you engaged with it in any way, it would flow into that contact the way water flows into a crack, not to drown you, just because that's what it does. I gave my 2 weeks' notice on a Tuesday morning, telling Gatlin I'd found another job, which was half true. I'd applied for a warehouse position in town and had a good feeling about it. He nodded and said he understood. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't try to convince me. He just said, "What? Leave the list in the desk for the next person. Add anything you think they should know." I took the yellow paper out of my pocket that evening and sat with it for a while. Gatlin's 8 original items were still legible, though the paper was soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. I got a pen and added 2 items at the bottom in my own handwriting, which is not as neat as Gatlin's, but is clear enough. 9. The phone has started ringing twice after midnight. The second call lasts longer than the first, and it gets longer every week. Let both calls ring. Do not answer either one. If the second call continues for more than 5 minutes, unplug the phone from the wall jack and reconnect it before the end of your shift. 10. You may find old log entries from people who worked this position before you. Do not look for them. If you find them by accident, read them once and move on. Do not try to identify the person who wrote them. It doesn't help. I put the paper back in the desk drawer. On my last night, everything was routine until 4 in the morning. The phone rang twice and I unplugged it. The floodlights triggered at 1:15 and shut off at 1:16. The KM3 shape appeared at 2:30 and disappeared at 2:50. I did my rounds. I drank my coffee. I read my book. At 4:12, the urge toward Section D came, and it was the strongest I'd ever felt it. Not just a pull, but a presence, a direct, focused awareness that I was in the office and that I was leaving soon, and that whatever lived in the back of that property knew both of those things. I sat at the desk and I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat with it. I let myself feel the full weight of the urge for the first and last time. Not resisting it, not indulging it, just acknowledging it. And for one brief, clear moment, I understood what it wanted. Not in words, not in images, in something older and simpler than either. It wanted company. It had been in that ground for a very long time. Longer than the cemetery. Longer than the name Fielder. Longer than anything with a name. And it was alone in the way that only something buried can be alone. And it reached toward the living the way a plant reaches toward light, not with thought or intention, but with need. And the phone calls and the shape on the camera and the pull toward Section D and the dense air between the headstones, all of it was the same gesture, repeated endlessly, the way a signal repeats from a transmitter that no one has turned off. The feeling passed at 4:31. I sat in the quiet office and looked at the security monitor and the clock and the walls, and I thought about Lloyd Yardley sitting on the ground in Section D, alive and unhurt, but changed. And I wondered if what had changed in him was that he'd understood the same thing I'd just understood and hadn't been able to carry the weight of it. I finished my shift. I watched the dawn come through the camera feeds, the property resolving from gray shapes into color and substance in ordinary daylight. Gatlin arrived at 6:15. I gave him the log binder and the office key. He shook my hand, which he'd never done before. His grip was dry and firm and brief. "You did good," he said. "Most people don't last a month." I asked him how long the job had been posted before I called. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me on the first day, evaluating, measuring. "About 4 months," he said. "You were the third person to take it. The other two didn't make it past the second week." I asked him what happened to them. "Nothing happened to them. They just stopped coming." Didn't call, didn't explain. That's what most people do. They stop coming, and then the position goes back on the board, and I wait for the next one. I nodded. I thanked him. I got in my car and drove down the loop road toward the front gate. As I passed through, I looked in my rearview mirror. The cemetery was behind me, green and still in the early morning light. The headstones casting small shadows on the grass. The maintenance building was just a building. The office was just an office. The road to Section D was just a gap in the trees. I got the warehouse job. I work days now, loading pallets and scanning inventory in a building with fluorescent lights and forklift beeping and people talking and all the noises that living, occupied spaces produce. It's fine. It's normal. I don't think about Fielder Memorial Gardens most of the time. But sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed in that drifting state between awake and asleep, I feel it. Not the urge exactly, more like an echo of it. A faint directional pull, as if some part of my attention is still oriented toward that property, 14 miles outside of town toward the Cedar Ridge and the old fieldstone markers and the collapsed wrought iron fence. And in those moments, just before sleep takes me, I have the thought, not a belief, not a conviction, just a thought, thin and persistent, that the thing in that ground felt me leave the way you feel someone leave a room, and that it's still reaching in my direction the way it reaches toward everyone who has ever spent time inside its range, not with malice, not with hunger, just with that ancient, patient, inexhaustible need to not be alone. I added a third item to Gatlin's list before I left, actually. I almost forgot. I wrote it at the very bottom of the page in small letters below the two numbered items without a number of its own. It said, "The thing in Section D is not dangerous, but it is sad." And sadness, in sufficient quantity and over sufficient time, becomes its own kind of gravity. Do not get close enough to feel sorry for it. I don't know if Gatlin kept that line when he gave the list to the next person. I don't know if there is a next person. I don't know if the phone is still ringing after midnight, or if the shape on Cam 3 has gotten taller, or if the urge has gotten stronger in the months since I left. I know that the listing was back on the county employment board 2 weeks after my last shift. I know because I checked. I didn't call to ask why. There's one more thing. I don't know where to put this in the story because it doesn't fit neatly into the timeline, but it belongs here, so I'll put it at the end. During my third week, on one of my midnight rounds, I walked past the front entrance area where the oldest accessible graves were, and I shone my flashlight across the headstones the way I always did. A brief sweep to confirm everything was in order. One of the stones caught my attention. It was a small granite marker, upright, old but well-maintained, with a carved border and legible text. The name on it was Ruth Fielder. The dates were 1901 to 1934. Below the dates was a single engraved line that I had to step closer to read. Still on the path, but leaning forward, angling the flashlight. It said, "She waits." I didn't note it in the log. I didn't mention it to Gatlin. I didn't look at that headstone again on any subsequent round. And I did not lean closer to any grave marker after dark for the rest of my time at Fielder Memorial Gardens. But I think about it. I think about the name Fielder on the entrance sign and the name Fielder on that stone. And I think about the handwritten log entry I found. I think the phone calls are her. And I think about Gatlin saying the ground wants attention. It doesn't know how to stop wanting. And I wonder if all of it, the whole property, the whole operation, the gates and the loop road and the office and the monitor and the log binder and the list of warnings, all of it exists, not to keep something out, but to keep something contained, to give it a place to be, to make sure that whatever Ruth Fielder became after 1934, whatever settled into that soil and learned to reach and pull and ring telephones in the dark, stays oriented toward the cemetery and the people who pass through it briefly instead of spreading further, seeping outward, reaching toward the town and the houses and the people sleeping in their beds 14 miles away. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if any of what I've told you has the explanation. I think it does. All I know is that the listing was back on the board and that Gatlin is still there and that the cemetery is still open and that somewhere in the back of the property, behind the cedar trees, the oldest graves in Section D are sitting in the dark right now. And something in that ground is reaching upward with the same low, patient insistence it has always had, waiting for the next person to sit in that office and answer the phone and step off the path and feel sorry for it. I hope whoever they are, they read the list.